on the eastern shore, all drinking water comes from fresh groundwater. This is different from a lot of areas in Virginia where a significant amount of water, it comes directly or indirectly from surface water streams, creeks, and reservoirs that are constructed to contain fresh surface water. On the shore, because of our geography, the fresh water is generally not available. The fresh surface water is generally not available for our use. Most of the surface water is, as everyone who lives on the shore knows, is in our tidal creeks and estuaries. And because they're tidal creeks and estuaries, most of the water is not fresh. Most of the water has some amount of salt in it. It's either very salty, close to ocean or bay water, or it's slightly salty, but still it has too much salt in it for us to drink. And so on the shore, all of the water we use for drinking comes from groundwater. And I know most everyone who will be listening to this knows a lot of this information, but I wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page. And so I've included some very basic definitions. And one is that groundwater is water that is stored and moves through coarse soils like sand and gravel. And this is a photo actually taken from one of the USGS websites, and I have some references to it. But what this photo shows in its most basic form is groundwater. And in this case, the person who took the photo dug a hole on the beach like many of us have done. And the hole didn't fill with the ocean water you see behind you. The hole filled with water that was contained in the sand. And this water is by definition groundwater. In this case, it's probably more likely than not salty, but there are some areas where you can dig a hole similar to this, and the water may be fresh depending on its location relative to the beach. But this is groundwater. If you bailed the water out of this hole, it would fill back in without the ocean flowing into it. It would fill back in with groundwater that's contained in the sand. If you also look carefully, right above the water line on this photo, you can see that the soils are saturated. This is something that's referred to as capillary fringe, and you will see it on some of the diagrams coming up in a few minutes. And this is where the water will feel damp or wet, but it still does not freely move the water. I'd also like to note that this discussion is really directed more for the shore, and in other areas of the Commonwealth, groundwater also moves through cracks and fractures in the bedrock. In our case, bedrock is more than 1,000 feet below the surface, and so that's not a source of water for us on the shore. Next slide. All right, now stepping just back, as I said, on the shore, all of our water comes from groundwater, and there is no surface water available. And also because of our geography, all of the fresh water that we have on the shore comes directly from precipitation that falls on the shore itself. In other areas of the state, you may have water falling, in the mountains, and then flowing over into other areas. On the shore, every drop of fresh water that is available to us is directly from precipitation that falls only on the shore.
Britt, how much of that water that falls is retained or absorbed?
I'll be covering that in just a minute. Now, and in terms of precipitation, we receive roughly 41, 42 inches per year, and it can vary. It typically varies about 10 inches per year, depending on whether it's a wet year or dry year. It's not unusual to have in the mid 30 inches per year. That would be a dry year, but it's not unusual to have in the 30s. And it's also not unusual to have up to 50, especially if we have a couple hurricanes come through on the shore. But in general, our average precipitation is about 42 inches a year. And of that, a portion, let me see if I can get rid of that without clicking through. Okay, a portion of that rainfall that falls on the shore, a portion of that 42 inches is removed by plants and trees through something called evapotranspiration, and that's just the roots take up that water and remove it, and that's really most of the precipitation is removed through evapotranspiration. Those plants include both crops, it includes grass, and also very significantly, it includes our marshland. A lot of the water that's removed is removed from our marshes and our forested area. We also have a significant amount of water that just is called surface runoff or overland runoff, and that's water that flows into ditches, creeks, and directly into the bay and ocean. And then to answer your question, only about 12%, or roughly 5 inches per year, of that precipitation actually infiltrates through the soil and becomes groundwater. And in this graphic, you can see the land surface, you can see the trees, and then and this is kind of a cross-section view. You can see the unsaturated zone, and that's soils where the groundwater is not available for us to use, but quite often the soils have a certain amount of water in them, and the water binds or binds to the soil similar to the way water would bead on a cup of glass. And so the very first photo I showed from the beach, you saw that little line of wet sand immediately above the water. That's the water that you might find in the unsaturated zone. And in the graphic in the far right corner, you can see it called out as the water that falls above the words approximate level of the water table. And so eventually, and it might take days, months, or years for this water that falls as precipitation on the ground to slowly infiltrate into and reach the top of the groundwater, which is where the sands are saturated. And then once it reaches the top of the groundwater where it's saturated, it will move, and it generally moves laterally, and it moves from typically on the shore. You can generalize that it moves from areas of high land elevation toward surface water bodies, and that surface water body might be a flowing ditch, it might be a creek, or it might be the bay or seaside.
So really, the water really flows from Route 13, basically, to either the seaside or the bayside.
Most of the water flows in the direction of either the seaside or the bayside, with the precipitation falling east of 13, moving toward the seaside, and most of the precipitation falling west of 13, moving toward the bay. Correct. Also, a relatively small amount of the groundwater is removed by pumping from wells and ponds. And on the shore, we have, for irrigation use, quite a few ponds. And the subject of another forum, I'd like to put a plug in for the ponds. The use of irrigation ponds as a source of water for irrigation is a very sustainable use of that water. But more detailed discussion on that is for a different forum. So backing up, and I think I've already used the term aquifer, but groundwater by definition is contained in an aquifer. And the definition of an aquifer is pretty general and pretty loose. It's any coarse grain, and I've also kind of modified this for the shore. It's any coarse grain materials such as sand and gravel that can supply sufficient water for a beneficial use. And the key words is supply sufficient water for a beneficial use. And that might be a single home. It might be for irrigation, lawn irrigation, or it may be for agricultural irrigation. But that's the definition of an aquifer. We also have something called a confining unit, and a confining unit does exactly what the name implies. It restricts the flow of water, and the confining unit is any fine grained material, such as a silt or clay, that significantly restricts the vertical movement of groundwater, such that the resulting groundwater is under pressure. And it's under pressure similar to the way water in a pipe in your home is also under pressure. Now, the shore is somewhat unique in compared to many areas and many other areas in the United States. You know, because the water is provided directly only by precipitation, the fresh water is floating on top of salt water, and because we are surrounded by salt water both on the bay and the ocean, the fresh water is floating on top of the salt water, similar to the way an ice cube floats on top of water. The fresh water is less dense than the salt water, and because of that, it will float on top of that salt water. And this is a general diagram taken from several different USGS publications that show in a very cartoon schematic way the basic shape of this freshwater lens. I will note that this is greatly exaggerated. This is exaggerated by several hundred times. If I showed you this cross section by scale, you wouldn't actually be able to see the thickness of this freshwater lens. This is roughly about 300 and at its deepest, it's about 350 feet, where you see the words freshwater. And then as you move toward the seaside or bayside, the depth of the freshwater is often less than 150 feet. And again, if we plotted this to the actual scale, this would not be, you could not see the fresh water in this lens. So it's something that we need to be concerned about in terms of preserving for our future use. So I defined aquifers as any coarse grain material such as sand and gravel that contains groundwater that can be used for beneficial use. The confining unit is any silt or clay that restricts the movement of that water. On the shore, we have 4 aquifers that we use for drinking water. The top is most commonly called the Columbia Aquifer. More recently, it's been renamed the Superficial Aquifer, and so often you'll see these names used interchangeably, but the Columbia Aquifer is the Superficial Aquifer. This is the groundwater that precipitation first enters, and so this is the top of the groundwater system. This is the youngest water, and then and so the roughly 5 inches a year of water that recharges the groundwater recharges the Columbia Aquifer. Below the Columbia Aquifer, we have the Upper Yorktown Eastover Aquifer, and that's recharged directly by the Columbia or Superficial by water slowly infiltrating through that clay. And this is a pretty slow process, and only a relatively small amount of the water that enters the Columbia reaches the Yorktown Eastover. Then you step down to the Middle Yorktown Eastover. A small amount of the water that enters the Upper Yorktown reaches the Middle Yorktown, and then when you reach, and then the bottom, the deepest, is the Lower Yorktown Eastover, and again, a small amount that reaches the middle makes it to the lower, and again, you know, as you step down to the deeper aquifers, less and less water recharges it, and this is also you know, our concern in terms of maintaining a sustainable supply of groundwater. I'd also like to mention, and this would also be a topic of future forums. There are paleo channels, and these are stream and ancestral stream and creek channels that cut through some of these confining units, and these paleo channels have the potential to bridge the aquifers. The USGS and DEQ is in the process of further investigating the function of these paleo channels. Right now, we have a pretty good idea where the major paleo channels exist. We have some information on their structure, but we still have a relatively poor understanding of the hydrology of these paleo channels and how these paleo channels interconnect with the rest of the aquifer system. And so this is an ongoing research area for the USGS and DEQ. So getting back to the question of how much water makes it to these aquifers, as I said before, roughly 12% of the precipitation that falls on the shore makes it to the groundwater, and that's the water that makes it to the Columbia or Superficial Aquifer, and that's about 5 inches, roughly 5 inches per year. Of that, less than 1% that makes it to the Columbia infiltrates to the Upper Yorktown Eastover, and then much less than 1% makes it to the middle, and then even less makes it to the lower. So again, I'd like to emphasize that the lower Yorktown Eastover receives the least recharge of all the aquifers, and therefore is most susceptible to being overdrawn by pumping.
Britt, how old is some of the water in the water?
I am very glad you asked.
Oh.
And you know the USGS did some age dating, and there's actually some good publications and presentations on the age dating, and then through some modeling efforts estimated the age of the groundwater in each one of these aquifers. And I thought this was useful information because it also illustrates how little recharge makes it to the deepest portions of our aquifers, and how much more water reaches the shallower. And again, the shallower the aquifer is, in general, the more sustainable it is. The deeper it is, the more susceptible it is to being overdrawn. And in this case, the Columbia or superficial aquifer, which is recharged directly from precipitation, is on the whole generally less than 300 years old, and in a lot of cases it's 50 years or less. Now, the fact that it's still 50 years old illustrates how slow groundwater moves. You know, if this was a stream, the water would be weeks, days, or months old. In this case, because the groundwater moves slowly through the sands, it's still generally 50 years old, but less than 300 in the superficial aquifer. As we step down to the upper Yorktown, it's 10 times older, 300 to 3,000 years old. The middle Yorktown, 1,000 to 10,000 years old, and then the lower Yorktown, up to 30,000 years old. And so we're reaching ice age water at that point.
Britt, I have a question.
Yes.
What can you say about the quality of the water? The older water versus the Columbia water that's.
Yes, and I have some information on that, but I will give a quick answer to that. In terms of the drinking water quality, the drinking water quality is very comparable, but the actual concerns, and each one has the ability to provide a good quality drinking water. Each one is also susceptible to issues that are either objectionable or have some potential adverse health effects. The Columbia, because it's recharged directly from precipitation, would be susceptible to things that we do today, or we did 50 years ago on the land surface. And so, especially in terms of agriculture, we tend to see, say, higher nitrate in the groundwater in the Columbia. Now, in a lot of cases, the levels of nitrate is well below levels that we'd be concerned about in terms of drinking, but it's more likely we're going to see higher nitrate in the Columbia. But then as you move into the Yorktown Eastover, especially as you get deeper toward the lower Yorktown Eastover, saltwater becomes an issue. And especially people who have blood pressure issues and sodium's a concern, you're far more likely going to have very high sodium in the Yorktown Eastover because it's floating on top of the salt water than you are in the Columbia. And so each one has different issues that you want to be concerned about. And there are some other qualitative issues. The Columbia, because of the recharge and its composition, it's more likely it might be a little on the acidic side, and you may want to buffer it with some treatment. On the other hand, the Yorktown Eastover, you may have a well that's in some old shell material, and the well water may be too hard, and you may need to use a water softener. Although water softeners can become problematic if you also have a high salt content. So that's probably more than you wanted at this time, but that's my overall summary of the aquifer system. Oops, and let me go back one. And that was also in response to the question, where does my drinking water come from?